Hello folks, this is David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, your pub chess bluffer, bringing you today a one-point chess tip on the topic of en passant, based on a situation that arose from the game that we see before us today, which took place at a chess party Halloween 2019. Here it is Black's turn to move, and Black advanced his pawn, the f7 pawn. The board is around the opposite way with the notation back to front here. It didn't affect the game at all. So what is on the board, the c2 pawn, actually the f7 pawn. Black advanced that pawn 2 spaces to check White's king. And that gave White the option of taking the pawn en passant, but the white player was not familiar with the en passant rule and failed to take the pawn en passant. And in this case, it would have been better for White to have used the en passant rule and take en passant. Instead, White took with the central pawn, and that opened up White's defenses to an attack from Black's rook. And Black went on to win the game from a material disadvantage. If you check out the setup here, Black has one rook and a queen, and White has one rook, a queen, and a bishop and a knight. And so White has a considerable material advantage, fewer pawns, it's true, but still White has a material advantage. But because White was not familiar with the en passant rule at a moment in the game when it was actually really important to play the en passant rule, or to activate the rule by playing en passant, White went on to lose the game. So what I'm going to do is set up this game on the Game Not practice board and take you through the en passant option. So we set up the board by importing the Fen notation. We have to make a couple of adjustments to get it exactly right. So that, I think, is the situation that was on the board. And as I said, Black advanced his f7 pawn 2 spaces to check White's king. Now, the en passant rule is that when a player advances his pawn in that opening pawn move 2 spaces, if it lands on a square adjacent to an opposing pawn, that pawn can take en passant in this way. That is to say, White's g5 pawn can take the f5 pawn by advancing to the f6 square. So the white pawn moves into that empty square that the black pawn passed through to take the black pawn. And that, if it actually happens, if White plays en passant like so, the black pawn disappears from the board. It is taken en passant, which, as you French experts will know, is French for in passing. The pawn takes the white pawn takes the black f5 pawn in passing. And this rule was brought in when the rule that allows the first move of the pawn to be 2 squares was brought in. Originally in early chess, the pawns only ever moved one space forward. But to speed up the game, to make it a more dynamic game, a new rule was brought in to allow the pawn to move 2 spaces forward in its opening move. The pawn can move 1 or 2 spaces forward, only in the opening move. But that created an anomaly because without en passant, if a pawn moves 2 spaces forward, the pawn on that 5th file, in the case of White, that is right next to it, loses its ability to ever take that black pawn. So to restore that position, to give that pawn back its power and its option of taking, the en passant rule was brought in. It would be rather to the detriment of chess if a player could see a pawn on the 5th rank and think, aha, I'll advance my pawn 2 squares and that fellow can never take me. So en passant was brought in. En passant must occur in the move immediately after the pawn moves 2 spaces forward from its starting position. 2 spaces forward from its starting position, take en passant immediately after. So that is the en passant rule. And in this particular game, it would have been beneficial to white to have played the en passant rule. But because white was not familiar with en passant, white did not use the en passant rule. And here, what white did instead was greatly to the detriment of white's position. White took with this central pawn like so, and that was a disaster because black, I don't think black did it immediately, but black is able at some stage now to activate his rook and or his queen to attack the king on this open row here. And in our game, or in the game that I was watching, in this game here, black used his rook to attack the king with the queen down here, restricting the king's options. And this ultimately led to the defeat of white from a position of material strength, from a stronger material position, because the position on the board had deteriorated. And it had done so because white had broken up this nice strong structure in the center of the board that's protecting the king from that rook's attack. And he broke it up because he did not know the en passant rule. So if you compare that to taking this pawn by en passant, like so, the pawn disappears, the structure in the center of the board is preserved, and there is a counter check, which is very nice. White checks the black king, and black will either take with the pawn or the king. Again, whether or not you want to break up your structure down here, I don't know. This was not played through, but it gives black some problems. And another way it helps white, this white's weak knight down here is being attacked by the queen and the rook. It does give white an opportunity to do something about that, I suppose. It might simply be better for white to continue attacking the king. However, the key point here is not what happened afterwards, but remembering that en passant rule and using it when it is to your benefit to do so, as it clearly was here. So that's en passant. Remember it. Just because you know the rule, however, it is not always beneficial to use it. In this case, you needed to use the en passant rule. You needed to take with en passant to preserve your position as white in the middle of the board. Okay, I hope that helps to clarify the en passant rule and why it is sometimes a good idea to use it. That's all for me, David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, your pub chess bluffer.